Chapter 11 is about corrections. The United States has the highest percentage of the population in prison of any Western country. The contemporary correctional system encompasses a wide range of institutions, ranging from a non-secured camp to a boot camp style corrections to supermax facilities and some in between. Despite these corrections, quote unquote corrections, i.e., supposed to correct behavior, half or more of all inmates will be back to prison within six years, either by violating their early release or parole after being deemed rehabilitated, or by reoffending. So the question is, does this system work? And there's opposing views. We have the just deserts versus the treatment. And our incapacitation model focuses on security and less on rehabilitation, meaning offender receives the appropriate punishment for one's actions. This point of view is the one experts point to as the result of crime declining, because we lock people up, lock people away for a long period of time, and that seems to be our current focus. Versus the treating offenders or correcting them with things like education, rehab, vocational training, and rather than put money into big facilities so we can house them under the incapacitation model, we put the funds toward treatment or correcting these individuals. The incapacitation model is the dominant view in this country, but correctional rehabilitation is still an important element of our criminal justice system, and in this chapter we're going to explore the history and nature of the correctional system. Start with the history. We actually talked about the history early on in the beginning chapters, but we talked more about it in chapter 9, so it might be refreshed in your head. In that section, we talked about punishments. You had a brief overview of the type of punishment over time, over the history, and an introduction into the beginnings of the correctional institutions. So I'm not going to elaborate on this. I do want to jump to the correctional system in the United States, the one or two paragraphs addressing the history from 20th century England to corrections under King Henry. I'll let you take a look at in the reading material. But I want to talk about the origin of correction in the United States. Just as in Europe, physical punishment was common in colonial America. Americans used stocks and branding and flogging, which is beating. That's a nice name, nice word for beating. And maiming, such as cutting off an ear or slitting nostrils, to punish offenders. The death penalty was used frequently. In 1636, the Massachusetts Bay Colony listed 13 crimes that warranted execution, including murder, practicing witchcraft, and worshiping idols. In New York State, 20% of offenses, including pickpocketing, horse stealing, and robbery, were capital crimes, warranting the death penalty. Jails were used to hold prisoners awaiting trial, but were not the punishment themselves. They were just holding people. They weren't the punishment themselves. The Puritans of Massachusetts believed that humans were naturally depraved, which made it easier for some of the colonies and the first states to enforce harsh punishments. In addition, some Puritans believed that humans had no control over their fate. They were predestined. Many early Americans felt there was no need for rehabilitation. The Quakers, led by William Penn, made colonial Pennsylvania an exception to the harsh practices often found in other colonies. The early criminal code of colonial Pennsylvania abolished executions for all crimes except homicide and replaced physical punishments with imprisonment and hard labor, and did not charge the prisoners for their food and housing. And modern correctional systems have their origins in Pennsylvania using William Penn's revised criminal code. So why were prisons developed? The philosophy of the Enlightenment, the age of the reason, emphasized the importance of the individual. After the French Revolution in 1789, which was based on the ideas of the Enlightenment, Western European countries abolished torture as a form of punishment and emphasized that the punishment should fit the individual's crimes. Rather than inflicting pain as the main element of correction, the idea of changing the individual became the goal, which I think is funny because the French Revolution did introduce the guillotine. But nonetheless, in England, John Howard, he wrote a book, The State of the Prisons in England and Wales, in 1777, in which he described the horrible treatment of prisoners. Howard thought that prisoners should not be harassed by keepers who extorted from them, nor should they have to suffer malnutrition and disease. He advocated segregating prisons by age, sex, and type of crime, paying the staff, hiring medical officials and chaplains, and supplying prisoners with adequate food and clothing. Howard called these facilities penitentiaries. Comes from the word penit, meaning to be ashamed or sorry for committing a sin or offense. Because he based his ideas on the Quakers' philosophy of people repenting, reflecting on their sins, and changing their ways. Public concern led the British Parliament to pass the Penitentiary Act of 1779. It called for the first secure and sanitary penitentiary. The law eliminated the charging of fees. Prisoners would live in solitary confinement at night and work together silently during the day. In 1787, in Pennsylvania, a group campaigning for more humane treatment of prisoners established the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, and that was led by Benjamin Rush. This organization, which included many Quakers, campaigned for the imprisonment of criminals rather than physical and capital punishment. The Quakers thought solitary confinement could reform criminals. In such cells, the offenders could think over their wrongful ways, they could repent and reform. In 1790, Pennsylvania established the Walnut Street Jail in Philadelphia for quote-unquote hardened and atrocious offenders. The association continued pressuring the legislature for more prisons. Eventually, in 1829, the state built the Western Penitentiary outside Pittsburgh and the Eastern Penitentiary near Philadelphia. The cells, it's important to mention their cells dimension. They were 12 by 8 by 10 feet in dimension, with individual exercise yards, isolated inmates so they could work, read their Bibles, and contemplate in order to be rehabilitated. Under these systems, they spent most of their time in solitary confinement. The only voice the inmates heard was that of the chaplain, and that was only on Sundays. The reformers thought solitary confinement not only allowed the offenders to repent, but also serve as a punishing experience since humans are social by nature. In addition, the system would be economical since under these conditions, prisoners would not take long to see the error of their ways and fewer guards would be needed. However, many prisoners found the total isolation very difficult to endure, and the prisons quickly became overcrowded warehouses for the prisoners. So the Pennsylvania prison system relied on solitary confinement for all but an hour a day. It reflected the influence of religion on corrections, and it eliminated the need for larger numbers of guards compared to the New York system. The New York authorities proceeded on much the same premise as the cause of crime, but adopted a slightly different solution in the construction of Auburn State Prison in the early 19th century. New Yorkers felt that the isolation of prisoners from arrival to release was too inhumane. It was both unnatural and cruel. Far from reforming men, they felt such absolute solitude bred insanity and despair. In addition, there was the issue, perhaps more pressing, of expense to the state. Inmates restricted to their cells 24 hours a day contribute nothing to the cost of their own confinement. The state had to provide all food, clothing, supplies, and materials to the prisoners. If the prisoners were to learn the advantages and satisfaction of hard work and thrift, the New York authorities believe there could be no better way than to be compelled to work together in harmony. If such a system also offered the potential for inmates to grow and harvest their own vegetables, raise and butcher their own meat, make their own clothes, and manufacture other items for use or sale by the state, such as a boon to the state's budget, could not reasonably be ignored. When the doors of Auburn Prison opened in 1819, America had the model and prototype of its maximum security prison. The New York authorities were as devoted as those in Pennsylvania to the idea of keeping prisoners isolated from each other and from the outside world. Prisoners were not even allowed to communicate with their families, except through the prison chaplain. New York's departure from the Pennsylvania system was in the commitment to provide a common work and dining area for inmates. However, silence among inmates was strictly enforced, so they couldn't speak to each other. They couldn't speak to each other in the Pennsylvania system either. The New York officials were deeply committed to the view that a steady, predictable, unrelenting routine of hard work, moderate meals, silent evenings, and restful nights in individual cells would produce men who were indeed cured of all vices and excesses. Because the inmates left their cells each day to work together, the cells in the Auburn style, or congregate style as it's called, in that style prison, they could be made smaller than those in the Pennsylvania style penitentiary. The Auburn cells were primarily for sleeping and were not intended to be the prisoner's entire universe. The inmates were awakened early, marched to work for a few hours before breakfast. After lunch, they returned to their jobs until dinner time. After the evening meal, they marched back to their individual cells to relax and sleep before going back to work the next morning. From sunrise to sunset, their days were occupied by a routine. They did not work on Sundays, and the long weekends were spent in the tiny cells that had not been designed as living quarters. On Sundays, they were addressed by the prison chaplain, and it was a very military-style approach. For economic reasons, most American prisons came to be patterned after Auburn and were as much silent factories and involved labor pools as they were bleak prisons. Auburn Prison, in fact, turned a profit in the early years of its existence. So, what about the two systems? Auburn, it was the cheapest, most productive way. Those who advocated for it, those who criticized it, said it was a breeding place for criminal associations because criminals were getting together and going to work, despite the fact that they still couldn't talk to each other. Pennsylvania, it was quiet, it was efficient. They believed it was humane and well ordered, keeping prisoners locked up most of the entire day, 23, 24 hours. But critics thought that solitary confinement was cruel and inhumane. New York's model eventually prevailed and spread across the United States, as I said earlier. Corrections in the 19th century. Here's the chart from the book explaining the differences between the two systems. Even though prisons were created to be more humane, a more humane form of punishment versus what was happening before prisons, the brutality still flourished. Prisoners were beaten. They were just beaten worse behind walls. Nobody can see it. It wasn't done in public. Private industry became the predominant theme institutions organized around, meaning that inmates were used for labor purposes. They were contracted out to private businesses, and prison corruption that also flourished. Because many prison administrators were corrupt, convicts were mistreated, used as cheap labor. However, a growing number of prison reformers were beginning to believe that the prison system should be more committed to reform. In 1870, the newly established National Prison Association met in Cincinnati, Ohio, and issued a Declaration of Principles. The philosophy of the Auburn system, which was fixed sentences, silence, harsh punishment, isolation, and lockstep work. They were out working, locked together. was considered degrading and destructive to the human spirit. The values of the Declaration of Principles included things like the penal system should be based on reform, not suffering, and prisoners should be educated to be free, industrious citizens able to function in society, not orderly inmates controlled by guards. Good conduct should be rewarded. Indeterminate sentences versus the mandated exact sentences, the determinate sentences, should include the ability for prisoners to earn their freedom early through hard work and good behavior. Citizens should understand that society is responsible for the conditions that lead to crime, and that prisoners should recognize that they can change their lives. Those were their principles. And the superintendent of the Elmira Reformatory in New York, Zebulon Brockway, he used some of these ideas when New York opened the reformatory in 1867 for male offenders who were the ages between 16 and 30 years old. So it was a young facility. Brockway believed that rehabilitation could be achieved through education. He implemented his plans in a military-style training way. And then other institutions followed suit, and it was working. But when World War I began, the prisons reverted back to the previous style of confinement. Prior to the mid-19th century, most offenders were sentenced to flat or determinate sentences, like I said, in prison. Under this type of sentencing, an offender received a specific amount of time to serve in prison for a specific crime. This created a major problem when prisons became crowded. Governors were forced to issue mass pardons, or prison wardens had to randomly release offenders to make room for entering prisoners. In the 17th century, English criminals were being transported to Australia from England to work as labor. Conditions were so bad that allegedly men who received reprieves from the death penalty, they cried. The first thing the English did was to eliminate the flat sentence structure used at the time. Instead of requiring convicts to serve their sentences with no hope of release until the full sentence had been served, they initiated a mark system, quote-unquote mark system, whereby a convict could earn freedom by hard work and good behavior in prison. The earned marks could be used to purchase either goods or a reduction in sentence. Prisoners had to pass through a series of stages, beginning with strict imprisonment, through conditional release, to final freedom. Movement through the stages was dependent upon the number of marks accredited. So you can see a system starting to develop here. Shortly thereafter, tickets to leave were instituted. It permitted convicts to earn marks to move from solitary confinement to a return to community on a conditional pardon, or as they call it, a ticket to leave on their own, be done. Brockway is credited with initiating indeterminate sentences and parole release in the United States. Brockway believed inmates should be able to earn their way out of prison through good behavior. Thus, they should receive a sentence that could vary in length depending upon their behavior in prison. In his opinion, this had two advantages. First, it would provide a release valve for managing prison populations. Second, would be valuable in reforming offenders because they would be earning release by demonstrating good behavior. Brockway had the opportunity to pioneer this proposal into practice in 1876 when he was at the Elmira Reformatory for its youthful offenders. Inmates at Elmira were graded on their conduct, achievement, and education. On the basis of their behavior in the reformatory, they were given parole. Volunteer guardians supervised the parolees and submitted written reports documenting their behavior in the community. A condition of parole was that the offender report to the guardian each month. By the turn of the century, the major concepts underlying parole were in place in the United States. One, a reduction in the sentence of incarceration based on good behavior in prison. Two, supervision of the parolee in the community. And three, indeterminate sentences. All were in place. By 1901, 20 states had parole statutes. And by 1944, every jurisdiction in the United States had some form of parole release and indeterminate sentencing. By 1927, half of all inmates were released in the United States to parole. Where are we here now as we roll into the 20th century, and then we'll talk about contemporary correctional institutions where we are today. In the 20th century, liberal prison reforms began. Prisoners were allowed more personal freedoms, such as being able to speak to each other, receiving mail, being able to have TVs and radios. Time outside was no longer strictly supervised, and they could mingle amongst themselves. Treatment facilities began to be specialized. Facilities for hardcore inmates and camps or agricultural centers where inmates grew vegetables and gardens for nonviolent offenders. So they started splitting up the types of facilities. Sadly, the vegetables and gardens for nonviolent offenders started to end in the 1970s. It's not particularly popular anymore. There are still some states that use it. Organized labor opposition ended convict lease system and forced labor. That was due to the rise of unions for laborers and the result of the Great Depression. Some aspects of life improved, but prison remained a destructive institution. There was still severe discipline, harsh rules, and solitary confinement. Those things remained. They still remain. Looking over the last 40, 50 years, there's been a period of change and turmoil in our correction system. There's three trends that kind of stand out. Prisoner rights movement. During the period of the 1960s through the 80s, the courts, while generally steered clear of the operations of the correctional system, much like law enforcement at the time, they kind of steered clear. But around that same time, both state and federal courts stepped in and began hearing cases involving the correctional system, as well as law enforcement, as we earlier discussed, and making rules relative to the treatment of prisoners. Rulings included prisoner right to freedom of religion, being able to practice their own religion within the facility. The right to free speech. However, I will say there's still limitations relative to their speech inside a facility. But they have the right to medical care. They have the right to due process. Remember that term, due process? We've learned it as a fairness throughout the court system. For due process, it means, in this setting, fairness in hearings. When they're up for parole and they're denied parole, there's a hearing process. For example, discipline issues, hearing process. They're entitled to due process. And proper living conditions. Violence was another trend. Still is another trend. Gangs, rapes, killings have become commonplace in facilities. Facility leaders attempt to control with harsher penalties for such conduct, housing violent offenders elsewhere and under tighter conditions. Overpopulation contributes to the factor of violence, as well as making it difficult to control violence. The other last trend is the reconsideration of the purpose of the prison. Older efforts to rehabilitate not working. During the 60s through the 80s, administrators clung to the idea that offenders were sick people who needed treatment, not punishment. Treatment could help them. Some states implemented such programs, one being a work release program, where an offender was allowed to work outside the institution during the day and returning to the facility at work. Some were also given longer furlough periods to work, where they can go out for the week and come back on the weekends, something like that, for example. These programs came under fire in the mid-'80s when a furloughed inmate, single incident, raped a young woman. After the incident, furloughs were restricted. Unfortunately, prisons are deemed places of control, incapacitation, and punishment. Even today, that's what they do. And they're not sites for reform or rehabilitation. The idea behind the system is that harsh treatment convinces offenders that crime does not pay and hence they won't reoffend. But that is not the case. Overpopulation and increasing correctional costs have and are occurring. Answers to these problems have been to only incarcerate the violent and dangerous offenders while allowing the others in community-based programs and treatment facilities. But the get tough on crime approach is, met by legislators and the judicial system. Legislators pass mandatory sentencing. And if somebody commits a particular crime with a mandatory sentence, it results in them having to go to prison. And a large number of nonviolent offenders get locked up. So that's a problem with our overpopulation and then the cost of corrections increasing. Now that's where we are. Next, we are going to review the two types of correctional facilities that exist today. We have jails and we have prisons, and we're going to start with jails next.